Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our very first Early Learning Lab webinar of 2019. I'm Sheetal Singh. I am the Interim Executive Director of the Early Learning Lab. And in this webinar, we're really going to be focusing on co-design and rapid cycle learning, sharing different models for bringing these methodologies into the work to support families and teachers of young children. So very quickly, I'm going to walk through the agenda for today. We have four wonderful speakers who are joining us to talk about their examples of using these methodologies in their work. Well, three, including me. I'm going to talk about a project that we ran here at the lab called the Parent Innovation Institute. And then we're going to be joined by Margaret Kasp from the Global Family Research Project. She's going to be talking about their use of human-centered design and what they've learned through using it, primarily in family engagement programs. Judy Brown from CivicMakers is going to be talking about their experience using co-design, human-centered design, and in particular, building a culture of co-design in organizations. And Gretchen Kirby from Mathematica Policy Research is going to be talking about an initiative that they ran in Colorado that they call LI Squared, and the use to help with the development of the early childhood workforce. So I invite you to listen to their presentations, and then after they each talk about their work, we're going to have a conversation between the panelists, and then we will turn it over to you and take some questions from the audience before we wrap things up. So we will be sharing the PowerPoint deck that we have with all of the attendees afterwards, as well as providing contact information so you have a chance to get in touch and ask any additional questions that you might have after the webinar. So we're going to move on with our next slide. And just really start by grounding ourselves in this question. We're talking about co-design and rapid cycle learning. We just want to make sure that everyone is using some shared language to understand what we're going to be talking about. So when we talk about co-design, we're really talking about creating solutions with your end user. And this goes beyond focus groups and surveys. To really be inclusive with in our case, parents, teachers, and caregivers of children, so that they're part of the design process. And this includes some hard work around power differentials and inviting people to work with you. So it's not a top-down process, which is used to, I think, in the nonprofit sector as we design programs, but it's really open-ended and generative. And it usually goes hand in hand with the concept of rapid cycle learning. Now, rapid cycle learning is different from traditional program evaluation, in which you design a program, you launch the program, you run the program, and then you conduct an evaluation to see if the program had the impact that was intended. There's definitely a time and a place for that kind of evaluation. But we do think that there is an opportunity in our field to be more iterative about program design so that we are analyzing data as we go along, understanding the impact that we're having, course correcting and iterating and improving along the way. So we're going to be talking about these two concepts throughout the webinar. And again, we invite you to ask questions towards the end if you have further questions. And we're going to just start off very quickly with a very quick poll. So we invite you to answer the question that we're going to put up in just a second, which is, who has used, or which organizations have used co-design and rapid cycle learning approaches in your work? Okay. So we have a large majority of people who are saying that they have not used co-design or rapid cycle learning, but they're interested, which I assume is why you're here. And so we hope that you will learn a little about both concepts and be able to start using these approaches in your work. So I'm going to move on to a presentation to tell you a little bit about some work that we launched at the Early Learning Lab, which we called our Parent Innovation Institute. Now, the Parent Innovation Institute was a program that we launched in 2018. It was a 9-month-long program that we ran in a particular neighborhood in Oakland, California. And we really created the Parent Innovation Institute as a learning space for parents and caregivers to work with program staff at 4 family serving organizations to experience the innovation process. So our goals for the project were to develop the leadership of parents in the community, but also the staff who are working at the organizations. We also wanted to create an ecosystem of innovation, or I should say build upon the existing ecosystem to bring the organizations that were serving these families closer together. The neighborhood that we're working in was actually quite small, and many of these organizations were a stone's throw away from each other. And they served often some of the same families, but they weren't necessarily working together. And so we wanted to build a culture of connection between those organizations as well. And then finally, we wanted to improve the programs and services they were offering to their families. So we had an open application process, asked organizations to apply to attend the Parent Innovation Institute. We chose 4 organizations. There were 16 participants in total, 2 staff people and 2 parents on each of the 4 teams. The lab, the Early Learning Lab, we brought in coaches, facilitators, and of course, they're all part of one community. The process, throughout the 9 months, we had 4 2-day workshops that all of the participants attended. And in these workshops, they really learned, we thought of it as a boot camp type approach. They learned about co-design or human-centric design, and they were given the tools that they needed to go out and then do the work in their community. In between the workshops, they received coaching from the Early Learning Lab staff, and they came together in community events and a final presentation in which they shared the prototypes that they launched. So our innovation cycle is a variation, and you will see different variations in different language that organizations use when they're talking about the design process. In the application, the 4 organizations were all asked to identify a problem that they wanted to solve. These were usually problems that had to do with connecting with their community, offering, getting more people to attend their services. We then took them through a process where they connected with their community. So they went into the community, they talked to parents who were coming to their programs, they talked to parents who weren't coming to their programs. They met these parents in neutral places within the neighborhood, so not necessarily just in their institution. And they really understood the problem from the perspective of their families. And this led to a process in which they would redefine that problem. Often there was some insight that was generated through that process that made them change the way that they were looking at their work. And then they worked with the parents in their community to reimagine their programming. So how might they improve their programs and services to meet these newly identified needs of the families they were serving? And then we walked them through a process where they would rapidly prototype new programs and services. So you're very quickly testing out ideas, gathering data, looking at the impact, and course correcting as they went along. And then at the end of the 9-month program, they had new programs and services that they could offer to the community. I will skip over my next couple of slides in which we talk about the 4 teams and who they were, and how their insights changed the way that they were addressing the problems. I invite you to look at this PowerPoint deck, which we will share with you, to get more information about the specific teams. And then I will also invite you to visit the Early Learning Lab website, where we have a case study where we go into depth on the teams, the process, their innovations, their prototypes, and the project as a whole. But I am going to pause here so I can hand over the the slide deck to Maggie from Global Family Research Project, and she's going to talk about their use of human-centered design now.
Thanks so much, Sheetal. I really appreciate it, and I'm happy to be here. I'm Margaret Casp, and as Sheetal mentioned, I'm the Director of Research and Professional Learning at Global Family Research Project. And our mission at GFRP is to connect research, policy, and practice to promote innovative strategies in family engagement in all of the spaces where children learn, including early childhood programs, schools, after-school programs, and libraries. And in our next slide, you'll see that a lot of our work is really based on research showing that family engagement improves children's outcomes. It leads to things like improved school readiness, higher student achievement, and really the increased likelihood of high school graduation. Yet, despite all that we know, we also find that families are rarely prioritized in the institutions in which children learn, institutions like schools, after-school programs, or libraries. And even more, there's this persistent false belief out there that ethnically diverse and low-income families are somehow less engaged and invested in children's learning than middle-class white families. So there's a real movement underway that we and others are involved in to help reconceptualize how we think about family engagement, so that we create shifts from organizations engaging just some families to engaging all families. Shifts from doing 4 and 2 families to really actively co-creating opportunities with them and leveraging families' strengths to do so. And for us, this is really where human-centered design thinking comes in. So what we've increasingly found is that human-centered design is a powerful process for really reinventing how families, schools, and communities can collaborate together. And there are 3 main reasons we see this playing out. First, human-centered design creates a platform for raising up family voice because it puts family experience at the center from which new ideas and services are developed. And second, human-centered design helps to strengthen relationships between families and educators because it requires a true sense of listening and trust. And relational trust is really at the core of family, school, community partnerships. And, third, human-centered design can really lead to programs and systems change as families, schools, and communities join together to specify problems, gather data about those problems, create and test solutions, and measure progress and create improvements, really. So we're seeing human-centered design as an important way for early childhood programs, schools, and other organizations to start to address difficult problems in collaborative and iterative ways with families and communities. So this fall, we actually had the chance to partner with Sheetal and others at the Parent Innovation Institute, as well as the National Center for Families Learning, to conduct a half-day workshop with about 60 early childhood family-focused practitioners to introduce them to human-centered design. And our goal was really to walk them through a truncated process of empathizing, defining problems, and ideating and prototyping. And we found that the experience was helpful for educators, but through the interviews and surveys and conversations, we also found that it was helpful for us to understand the value that early childhood educators from their own vantage points thought human-centered design could bring, which is something which is less well understood. And what the early childhood folks really pointed to were 5 main benefits. First, they felt that human-centered design empowers families and creates equity. Many of the educators we talked with reflected on how often the people who speak at family meetings are not always representative of the group. So by having a process where everyone's voice is intentionally included, it really creates a more fair and just system. Educators also saw the process as challenging assumptions and biases. Many talked about how the listening process really forces educators not to pass judgments, but to really listen and see things in a new light. And the process also helped educators consider families' wishes and desires. And they also like that human-centered design is team-oriented and rooted in collective decision-making. And finally, many educators felt like the process could really push them out of their comfort zones sometimes the process of seeking feedback and talking with families feels awkward, but because it's built into the process, educators really felt like it could start to feel more natural. So my hope is that in this short peek into human-centered design in the family engagement field, that, you know, as we open up the conversation and the dialogue, that we can hear from you about how you've been engaging families in your human-centered design work, and also how you might be planning to do so.
Thank you, Maggie. That was great. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining. My name is Judy Brown, and I am the co-founder and chief impact officer of CivicMakers. We are a strategic consulting firm. We bring innovation and engagement strategies into the public sector. You'll see that our clients are mostly municipalities. We work with some state agencies. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about embedding a culture of innovation and design within large bureaucracies. Given that most of you work in education, I'm sure that this is something that's familiar to you, working within systems that have a lot of different actors, trying to find some elements of convergence. And so I want to talk through at least a couple of examples that I think will map to some of what you might be experiencing in bringing these tools into your work. Some of the way that we do our work is applying the human-centered design thinking process to these different buckets. Those would be around community engagement, strategic planning, and change management. So we take these sort of more traditional disciplines and we apply exactly what Maggie was talking about, an iterative, human-centered approach so that we are creating things in smaller segments as opposed to creating one giant program that isn't ultimately going to work for a variety of users. So this is what co-design looks like. I just wanted to harken back a little bit to what Sheetal was saying about co-design. One thing that I find fascinating is that the concept was actually rooted in the public sector. It started in participatory design techniques that were developed in Scandinavia in the 1970s. Some of you may be as excited as I am about participatory policymaking, where we are finding some common ground between expertise and lived experience. So this has been happening in quite a few public sector entities for quite some time. Language, I think, is really important in this space. So sometimes words like design and innovation can be a little scary and off-putting. So what this also is co-creation. Sheetal talked about this being generative, but ultimately we're focusing on involving as many stakeholders as possible, and not just on design as a discipline, but also in how we design processes and procedures. Next slide, please. So why co-design? We did talk about that a little bit, really just democratizing this concept of design. Everyone is a designer in some ways, this photo that you're seeing right here is a group of folks from the city of San Rafael. The city of San Rafael hired us to teach all 400 city employees human-centered design, and what that looked like was helping to create a culture where the concept of valuing creative idea generation throughout the organization is just how business gets done. Next slide. And this kind of maps to the way in which we think about the culture building around innovation, which is that it aligns with all of these different elements. So we have the values and vision, as I mentioned, some strategic planning. Service design is where we actually get in and kind of build the thing together. Change management is about getting people on board with what's going to happen. And then this reflective practice piece is about really focusing on the individuals that make up the entire organization. And this is what we're calling the culture stack. Some of you who are in ed tech, for example, may be familiar with a technology stack. So this is kind of the cultural element of it as we're envisioning it. Next slide. So one way in which we're measuring this culture change is through design principles. So you'll see here that this case study is with the city of San Rafael. These guiding principles actually help to frame their entire innovation initiative and have been co-created. So the city manager's office put out some idea of what these principles could look like, created a working group, and then they co-created these principles that everyone can get behind. So this is similar to values and vision and mission. Next slide. So what we've done is we've taken these design principles and we've mapped that to how we might measure something as presumably and in fact difficult to measure as culture change. So you'll see that these questions here actually map to some of the guiding principles, and the change that you see on the bottom is the change that has happened over time after these different cohorts have gone through what we actually call a learning lab as well. So they get this survey before they do the 12 weeks of applying human-centered design in the learning lab, and then after the 12 weeks, and then we give them the survey again a year later. It's not a perfect framework, but it is a framework. Next. And I am done. Handing it off to Gretchen.
Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to be part of this webinar today and to talk about the work that Mathematica is doing with a set of grantees in Colorado that's focused on the early childhood workforce innovations. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm switching gears just a little bit from human-centered design to rapid cycle learning, but I think that you will hear a lot of the same words being spoken and be able to see how they really connect and integrate together. This work is really a co-creative partnership to find local solutions to critical issues facing the early childhood workforce in Colorado. So at the center of this partnership is Early Milestones Colorado, which is an intermediary organization that advances opportunities for early childhood success. Early Milestones launched this initiative to address the growing demand for educators of young children in ways that also recognize the struggles that come with recruiting and retaining a robust workforce in a field in which wages are typically low, benefits are lacking, and work environments can often be challenging. So 6 local grantees received awards just about a year ago to develop and test ideas to attract, develop, and support the early childhood workforce. And I'll talk a little bit more about those strategies in just a second. You'll see at the bottom of this triangle, there's also an advisory team that's comprised of foundation leaders and state-level administrators that help guide the initiative's plan and the grantees' work toward their goals. And then Mathematica was brought in as a learning partner to provide technical assistance that supports rapid iterative improvements to really get projects up and running quickly and to provide evaluation to inform the initiative as a whole. As an organization, Mathematica has provided policy research, data collection, and data analytics support to a range of federal, state, and local clients for 50 years. Our mission is to improve public well-being by bringing evidence to bear on policy and program decisions. Okay, next slide. So the 6 local grantees include a school district, a county department of public health, and 4 early childhood councils. But the grantees are not working alone. Rather, they're really expected to engage with other local partners that can include higher education institutions, workforce development offices, and importantly, directors of early childhood programs at the local level. So to achieve the initiative's goal of building an effective, qualified early childhood workforce, grantees were asked to focus on 1 or more of 4 levers for change that are shown on this slide. Building career and education pathways, improving compensation, developing targeted recruitment strategies, or improving working conditions. So in the interest of time, I won't go into the details of each of the strategies, but most are intended to move the needle on multiple levers for change through different components. Okay, next slide. So what Mathematica brings to this work is the use of a framework that we call Learn, Innovate, and Improve, or LI squared. And I just want to clarify that this is not a framework that we use just in Colorado. In fact, this framework was developed together with the Administration for Children and Families and the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. And we've used it in many areas, including for TANF and workforce development for low-income individuals. But LI squared supports iterative learning cycles that really bring social science theory, research evidence, and practice wisdom together with the goal of creating practical, scalable, and sustainable innovations. So our role is to guide grantees through use of the LI squared framework to define, roll out, and test components of their strategies. The framework stresses being very intentional and precise early on in defining goals and ways in which success can be measured. So that's really sort of the learn and innovate stages. And then it provides a flexible framework, but not a prescribed or rigid process for using information in the improved stages for rapid iterative improvement and evaluation. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to try to touch quickly on the features of LI squared and bring in a couple of examples of the work with the grantees. LI squared really emphasizes this co-creative process to inspire innovation and support improvement by really testing pieces out in a contained setting before sort of going big or large scale. As you've heard throughout these presentations, we know that innovations can be scary. People just don't like change generally, but by starting small and sort of low risk, it can give everyone sort of that sense of safety to take the risks that can generate and inspire new ideas. So early milestones really set the stage for this at the very beginning by putting out, even in the RFP, messaging to grantees that they would not be out on their own. They're expected to have viable plans and partners in place to sort of make things happen, but that they'd be given the latitude and support to adjust in response to information as they went along. They weren't expected to be perfect from the get-go. This ties in with working collaboratively to refine the installation and implementation of new strategies through technical assistance and evaluation. So we, meaning Mathematica, wanted grantees to know from the onset that we weren't coming in to do an evaluation to them. Sort of as Chital mentioned earlier, going in at the beginning and the end and sort of giving a thumbs up, thumbs down. We really work with the grantees throughout to think about when and how to collect information that would be useful to them. And working collaboratively with the grantees really helps build their capacity to institutionalize the improvement processes and use of LI squared or some similar framework. So for instance, our Mathematica team won't fully design a feedback mechanism like a short survey or what have you. We ask grantees to do a first draft, even if it's just bullets of what they hope to learn, and then we'll work with them to help them refine it. They administer it, and then we work with them to sort of interpret the results. Okay. Throughout every stage, we really ground the work in evidence to inform innovation, being the researchers that we are. We're always going to emphasize using the information that's available. So I know I'm running out of time, but very quickly, how this works in terms of the use of information throughout LI squared is through road tests. These are iterative learning cycles that can really break larger strategies down into manageable pieces and gather information as you go. So as you can see here, the learning cycles can be quite short and focus on very specific aspects of a strategy. The mechanisms for obtaining information about what you're learning can be relatively informal, but the key is that they're very intentional in being tied to goals and helping you get the information to measure the success that you're trying to achieve. I think I will end there and give us the time we need for questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of our presenters and our panelists for sharing so many different models of using co-design and rapid cycle learning in this work. I'm sure the audience have lots of questions because we threw a lot of information out. So I invite everyone to submit questions through the Zoom platform. We will try to answer them during the Q&A portion, but we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we have some questions that we've prepared for you as well. So we are going to be, I'll kick it off with a question, actually, that I was hoping Maggie could answer first. But And this is a little bit about the background and the need for these approaches in our work. In your experience, why do you think that there is a need for co-design and rapid cycle learning in family engagement work in particular? What have you seen in your history that really makes you think that this will improve the way that we're working with families?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And we've been seeing actually some really neat examples of different organizations in the early childhood field using human-centered design to build family, school, and community partnerships. And, you know, for sure, the work of the Parent Innovation Institute that you all did, for sure, that's one. But we've also seen a number of libraries starting to use the process as they transform many of their services and resources to becoming increasingly family-centered and friendly. You know, libraries are often overlooked, I feel like, in that early childhood landscape, which is unfortunate because they do a lot with families in helping them develop the knowledge and skills and competence they need to develop literacy, mathematics skills with their children, and, you know, really just connect to other resources that a community can offer. So even in California, we know that the State Library Association there has even invested in training the majority of its librarians in a parenting program. So all of this ties into design thinking because we've really seen it as a tool to help strengthen that family work. For example, we worked with Watertown Public Library in Massachusetts to really help them reimagine what their infant story time could look like. We went through a process where we asked librarians to observe a story time and then talk with families afterwards, and then worked with them to really synthesize what they had learned over time. And, you know, what they started to see was that families really, more than anything, valued that time where they had, you know, opportunities to connect with other families in that space. Just even talk about, you know, when should I turn the car seat forward or backwards? So, you know, as part of its services going forward, the library began to integrate more opportunities for families to network. And it was through that human-centered design approach, only through observing and listening to families, were they able to make that change. We've seen family math groups using human-centered design as an opportunity to really talk with practitioners about the types of math resources that they need to engage families more meaningfully in their work. And even for folks who are interested, the Teachers Guild, which is sponsored by IDEO, actually has a little competition going on right now around the question of how we can strengthen communication and trust between families and teachers to support students' success. So, you know, we're seeing a lot of ways the human-centered design is, in a sense, becoming a lever to bring families and schools and communities together, really to co-create and problem solve in exciting ways.
Chantal, can I offer a sort of perspective from the evaluation perspective?
Of course.
Yes.
I mean, one reason that, you know, me and some colleagues at Mathematica, many colleagues really are interested in using co-design and rapid cycle learning is, you know, just as you mentioned early on in the webinar, when we do evaluations of programs that, you know, design a program, put it out there, do an evaluation in 2 to 3 years, and guess what? We don't see the impacts on families and children that we would really all hope to see. And the answer sort of over and over again became, well, it was poor implementation. Okay, well then let's really work on that along the way. And, you know, as an evaluator, we don't want to come in after the fact and just say, oh, this didn't work, or, you know, and here's why. We want to be part of the solution too. And I think that that's what's so exciting from an evaluator or technical assistance perspective, is really being part of that process to help programs improve and staff build the skills they need, and, you know, so on, and so that we can really develop programs in ways that are going to affect the outcomes that we really want to change.
Well, Gretchen, just to build off of that in terms of evaluation, How do you approach measuring impact when using these methods?
Sure. Well, I'm going to think of impact in sort of a broad way rather than the typical research impact way. But so things like the LI squared framework or rapid cycle learning of whatever type really just lends itself to this continual collection of information and building up evidence as you go. Little e that can sort of roll up into pieces to become that big E when we're really ready to evaluate through like a randomized control trial. But really embedded in the process is this intentional planning from the start to specify how to define what success would look like and how you measure it. So at the early stages, really looking at aspects of implementation, possibly more along the lines of process or output measures, or doing sort of a deep dive on a very specific component with, a small sample in one place with 2 teachers or what have you. But then as things, sort of get refined and implementation is refined and you get closer to full scale or full model build out, the level of rigor in the learning cycles can increase, so that you can really start to measure the outcomes, the targets of change, and ultimately the outcomes for staff, for centers, children, and families. And this could be done with existing administrative data or larger scale data collection effort, possibly even a quasi-experimental or randomized controlled design. But again, these kinds of frameworks allow for that to happen over time and to increase the rigor as implementation is refined and the innovation is really sort of grounded in practice.
Judy, I would invite you to also share your approach. Thank you, Gretchen,
Sure.
for that information. I've just noticed that we are getting a lot of questions coming in about how you measure success just more generally of this type of work. And I know, Judy, you've been thinking a lot about culture change that is necessary for these approaches to really take root in an organization. So can you talk a little bit more about how you've been measuring culture change?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not surprised that the question of how we're measuring impact and success is coming up, right? Because I recognize that this is an ongoing challenge in our field. The field that I mostly live in is civic innovation, right? So I'm bringing these tools and methodologies and mindsets in some way to organizations that don't typically think about problem solving in terms of collaboration, right? So as I mentioned, and you saw on the slide deck, using something like in this world we say design principles, which is basically I call them like the bumpers on a bowling lane, right? So if we have free range around what we can create together, we can end up in the gutter because we don't have anything that really kind of helps us constrain our co-creation, right? These are all a lot of words that fit into this methodology, but in some cases, what we're doing essentially is before we even design our engagement strategy, we want to learn from the people who we're going to engage with how they want to be engaged, right? So what that might look like is some little bit of even like you had mentioned, Sheetal, moving beyond surveys and focus groups, right? But we can use that existing infrastructure because that's what people are used to. And the data that we can collect from that can help inform how we even move forward in our co-design, in our rapid cycle learning, which are components of a broader project. Now, if that broader project has the bumpers on the bowling lane that are design principles that everyone has been brought into, then we can use those to help measure whether or not we can turn those into just a way in which we communicate with each other, how the project gets done, but also we can map them to how we might actually measure the change over time, especially when it comes to something like culture. And before, okay, I'll stop there, but I'm seeing some questions that are very intersectional, so.
That's part of the joy of hosting a webinar is listening to your co-presenters and also checking for new questions, and it gets a little overwhelming. Gretchen, did anyone else want to join in on measuring success? Have a perspective you want to share on how you're doing that?
It's hard, but you know, again, putting on the researcher hat, we get so sort of distracted by measurement. And one thing that's been really sort of, I don't know, revolutionary in a way for me is to really work with the grantees on what they think success will look like. You know, have them articulate what it is that they really think they're working towards and what would success look like to them, and to do that definition first, and then try to figure out, oh, okay, well, how would we measure that? You know, sometimes we think of, well, let's define outcomes based on what we can measure. And you know, this is really turning it on its head to put the challenge on measurement. Okay, let's define how we want it to look and figure out how to measure it. It's not an answer to the challenge, it's just a different perspective.
Great, thank you. So as we're talking about measuring success, I think there's also a basic fundamental question about how do we set ourselves up for success? So say you are an organization that's embarking on using these techniques in your work, and you know, maybe we can speak a little from our own experience of challenges that we faced and how we've overcome them. And I wonder if maybe Judy or Maggie, you want to share a little bit about some pitfalls that you know, organizations should watch out for, and ways that they can kind of guard against them.
You know, Sheetal, I'll jump in for a second, you know, and this sort of stems maybe from a conversation we had, you know, a number of months ago when we were talking about the Parent Innovation Institute, and something that, you know, had emerged from families who had been involved in it for you. And I know you talked about so eloquently was this notion of in human-centered design, there's often this sense of, you know, we fail fast and we fail hard, you know, or quickly. And, you know, for, you know, what does that mean in communities for families where failure is not an option? The number of resources available are very few. And when initiatives come together, this notion of failure, it's really just not on the table. So what does that look like when a process that's, you know, fundamentally rooted in iterative change and incremental change is pit against potential opportunities for failure and potential pitfalls. So for me, when I hear you talk about that challenge, it resonates for me, because I think as we think about this work with families and communities, I think that that's paramount in my mind of what we have to consider.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that challenge, Maggie. And I agree. And I would also say that, you know, another stakeholder group that we haven't spoken about yet are the funders. So, you know, how a funder approaches the work and their openness to iteration and not knowing ahead of time exactly what's going to happen, and being open to changes or failures, if we want to use that scary term, is also, I think, a really important component of this work. And, you know, I hope that more funders can take the risk that's necessary in supporting work of this kind, because the payoff could be huge. And, you know, sometimes we just need to be open, I think, to learning from the people that we're working with. Judy, are there other things around building culture that any advice that you have for organizations?
Yeah, I love that you brought up I'm gonna just pull the thread on the funder conversation, right? Because I know that we get a lot of questions about measuring the impact, because a lot of those measurements are defined by the funders, right? So there is a balance to allowing for these sort of emergent indicators to to be validated both within how you're measuring the success of your own intervention, but also to communicate with funders. So what we do around the measuring of culture change is there's a lot of storytelling involved in it, right? There's a lot of like little moments where you realize it's working. And when I say it's working, what that looks like to me is, you know, when I'm working with a group of, say, 30 cross-departmental teams within a city that have never used design or innovation or, you know, that, as I mentioned, get intimidated by some of the conceptual elements of this. There are these sort of critical moments that happen where they start using the language and they start understanding the concepts, right? There are things that I specifically leave out when I do human-centered design thinking trainings. I think for the benefit of those of you on the call who have not completely absorbed this as just the way you live your life, which is what sort of happens once you get into really embracing this framework for change. There is this idea that it's a mindset, right? It's not about necessarily mastering each component, but it's about us collectively shifting our perception of how work gets done and how co-creation happens. As I mentioned earlier, it's about finding that blend between expert and lived experience to help inform and design for everyone, which is the really exciting piece of all of this. So I'm addressing this question. So I think that maybe if we have these stories that we can share with funders and we can start thinking through how we can make impact measurement as iterative as the things that we're measuring. I think what I find a lot in this work is, you know, if I work with California Health and Human Services, Child Protective Services, and their measurement of success is around how many payments, child support payments they're getting annually or quarterly. Is that really success? What stories come from that, right? So the offer is that by really socializing this method throughout an organization, that we can influence funders from the bottom up, or at least that's what I'm hoping we can do anyway.
And I want to build on that and what Maggie was talking about as well in terms of the failing fast analogy, right? Because there's one thing about, even, you know, with funders and with programs, it's sort of how badly you're going to fail. And the failing fast is about sort of learning things quickly so that the failures actually are fairly small. You know, it's better to skin your knee and get up and keep going than to, you know, fall down a whole staircase and break every bone in your body, right? But it's having those little lessons along the way that actually are going to produce a much larger return on investment for funders, for policymakers, for program administrators. So it's sort of how we think about that failing fast means fail small and quick rather than waiting too long and then really failing big and ultimately failing families and children.
Thank you, Gretchen. That was, I love that analogy of the skin knee versus the broken bones. I like the bumpers on the bowling alley too.
Yes, we've got lots of good analogies.
Yes. So I just wanted to wrap up because we've tossed a lot of information at folk, and I believe that there are probably still lots of questions that people have. So my last question for you guys would be, how can organizations get started? How can they, say they're a complete novice, they're learning about these methods for the first time, where can they turn to get more information, and how can you start bringing these methodologies into your work? Maggie, do you want to field this one first with some resources?
Yeah, so on our website, and I think in the chat box, we've sort of put out a few resources for you to turn to in collaboration. Sheetal and the Parent Innovation Institute have written a few blogs on our site about more about the work that they've done. We're going to be coming out soon with a brief that sort of highlights some of the findings from the workshop that we did back in the fall. And we also have a primer that we put together that sort of defines some of these key processes around what human-centered design is. So I think those are great places to start. And also thinking about, that intentionality and, thinking about how, human-centered design in a sense is, partly a process of bringing people together in this intentional way. So, keeping your mind on, so who, and, somebody said this before, who you're going to start to bring together to read these materials with, so you're not in isolation.
Judy, do you have other resources or advice for people who are just getting started with this?
Yep. Sorry, I'm like going through and trying to answer some questions too. So, yeah, there's just so many things happening, and I'm very excited about it. Okay, so the question is how to get an organization on board with adopting the process.
Yes.
Yeah. So I would say one thing that I really like to do, oftentimes it's that I'm able to do this work because there's executive level buy-in. So basically leadership is saying, what we're currently doing isn't working, so we need to do something different. I'm still trying to figure out how we, and I think that, there's some hypotheses around how we can make this a little more bottom up and really stakeholder driven. But oftentimes I am simply asking the question of whether what we're doing is currently working. And if it's not, then we should try something different. And what we try that looks different is what I like to call business as unusual, right? And especially in government. So it's that we can either, stay the status quo, or we can try something different. And I'll even have some slides that will have the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, right? So I think that, again, the storytelling piece, even having these sort of 30-second sound bites around how we have witnessed change within large bureaucracies is really helpful in getting others on board. And what we're doing here, right? Having a conversation like this, sharing some of the proof points, because the reality is that we're so early on in really applying these methodologies to all of this, even using co-creation in a way that we don't have 10, 15-year longitudinal studies in this space. So it's up to us to kind of continue to make the argument, back it up with the data that's possible, and really the stories and the people and the communities who are behind it.
And I just want to second what you said about leadership buy-in. So we found in our work that it's been really important, and we're had a couple of examples from other projects that other organizations ran where you don't want to get into a scenario where you're really empowering the people on the ground and exciting them about these processes and helping them to see what's possible and changing, but then it gets shut down at the top. And when that happens, that could be very sad and frustrating for everyone involved. So the best examples of success we've seen are when it's there's a balance. It's both top down and bottom up in terms of the organization, and there's support all around for finding business as unusual and new ways to do the work. Gretchen, did you want to jump in as well with readiness criteria or any thoughts about that from your standpoint?
No, I don't have anything specific to say about readiness criteria, but one thing I guess I want to say just about where to begin. I mean, you all have talked about the leadership being on board and how you build the culture among staff. And again, sort of from the evaluation perspective, I think what's really unique about this work and how different organizations at the local level or state level can engage with it is that there's no beginning, right? You can sort of jump in wherever you are. and start working from there. So you could be at the very beginning, have an idea, and you're trying to build it out. You could be, rolling different pieces out, but you would need to refine them before you roll out others. You might even have a full-scale model you think is in place, but you want to take a good look at it and, sort of break down the pieces of implementation to see if you're really ready for evaluation. So again, sort of from that evaluation perspective, using a rapid cycle learning approach can sort of fit in to wherever programs are.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I think we have just about a minute left, so I'm going to offer this. We had a ton of questions come in that I think we've all been scanning. Some people have answered within the chat box themselves. For the rest of us, what we can promise is that the presenters, we're going to take your questions. We're going to try to answer as many as we can, and we will put that out as a resource to send to all of the attendees. We will also share our slide decks, so you have our contact information, and you also have everything that you've seen in the presentation. I want to thank Gretchen, Judy, and Maggie for joining in this webinar, for sharing these different models for bringing human-centered design and rapid learning to our work. We talked about setting up for success, we talked about measuring success, and finally, we've given out some great resources to all of you on ways to get started with work. This is the beginning of a conversation. We invite you to stay in touch, and any last words from any of you guys for our audience before we sign off?
Thank you for the opportunity. So
thank you.
To learn from the panelists and all of these great questions that I'm going to be thinking about, because this will just help our work move forward. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Guys, so look for those resources. Thanks so much for attending our webinar, and we'll have more over the course of this year. So bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.